In this video, we'll be learning about bearings. Now, what bearings are, in essence, are angles. And typically, we used to use bearings, and we still do to some extent use bearings, when we're, for example, hiking and have to determine our direction as we're traveling, or when we're sailing, for example, we sail thanks to bearings. Now, the idea behind bearings is the following. If we're standing at a point A, and we're told that we have to travel at a bearing of, let's say, 30 degrees for 5 kilometers, what that means is that we need to face north, which quite typically on any exam paper will point upwards, just as on a map, north. And from north, we have to measure 30 degrees clockwise. Remember, always measure bearings clockwise. And we would turn clockwise from north 30 degrees. And then, since we were told we had to walk 5 kilometers, we would walk in that direction for 5 kilometers. And then we would reach our destination, which I'll call B here. 5 kilometers. Now, that's what a bearing actually is. Now, a few key bearings that should be known. If we just look at a typical map, we would have north, which I'll write here as N, south, east, and west. Just to point out a few must-know bearings. The bearing of east is 90 degrees. The bearing of south is 180 degrees. Remember, each time here, I'm measuring these directly from north going clockwise. So, to get from north to east, I turn 90 degrees clockwise. To get from north to south, I turn 180 degrees clockwise. To get from north to west, we'll have to turn 270 degrees clockwise. So we can add bearing of west is 270 degrees. And last but not least, the bearing of north is, we can either think of it as 0, or if it makes it easier, we could also think of it as 360. In other words, a full circle. But 360 is the same bearing as 0. So the bearing of north is just 0. Is 0 degrees. Now, an important thing to point out here is that bearings are always written with 3 digits. So we write bearings with 3 digits. This is very important. What I mean by this is the following. Let's say we have a bearing of 30 degrees. We don't write 30 degrees. We write 030 degrees. That's how we write a bearing of 30 degrees. Or for example, if we had a bearing of 0 degrees, we would write 000 degrees. It's important to distinguish those two things. That's the angle as we would write it on our diagram or measure it with the protractor, and these are the corresponding bearings. Now let's look at another very important rule with bearings. Let's say I'm at point A, and I travel, I'll just label that point A, and from A we travel at a bearing of 40 degrees, let's say, to a point B. So remember, from A we measure from the north, which is upwards. 40 degrees, we measure 40 degrees clockwise from the north. So with our protractor, we would measure 40 degrees. And let's say to get to B, we're traveling 5 kilometers or 5 miles. B. 5 kilometers. Now we write this as the bearing of B from A. The from A is important, is 0, 40. But now, what if we're asked for the bearing of A from B? In other words, although this question may look very similar to what we've just shown, it's actually quite different. In this case, you have to imagine that we had our point A here, we've traveled to B. Now remember, the bearing of B from A was 40 degrees, that's north, and we had our 40 degrees here, clockwise. What is the bearing of point A from B? In other words, in this case, we're standing at B now, and if we point north as upwards, we're now interested in this angle, the angle which joins the north to the line segment BA. Remember, this is measured clockwise. Well, you may see it directly off this diagram. This angle here is also 40 degrees, and to that we're adding 180 degrees. And so the bearing of A from B, bearing of A from B, is the 40 degrees we had plus 180 degrees. And in fact, this will always be true. Bearings between 2 points will always differ by 180 degrees. And here's a quick trick. If ever, let's say, we can always use this formula, by the way, we can always just add 180. Let's say, for argument's sake, that we have the bearing from A to B is 200 degrees. Then in this case, the bearing from B to A will be this. We can use the same method again. That's 200 plus 180. That's equal to 380 degrees. But now think of this carefully. 380 degrees is equal to 360 degrees plus 20 degrees. And since we saw at the beginning of this video that 360 degrees is the same thing as 0 degrees, the bearing of B to A is 20 degrees, which remember we write with 3 digits as 0 to 0 degrees. And there you go. That's our first short course on bearings.